My name is Jean Athey. I'm with Peace Action Montgomery, and we're the sponsor of this event, along with a number of co-sponsors. And I want to tell you who all is co-sponsoring this. In addition to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Rockville, we have Pax Christi St. Francis of Assisi, Pax Christi St. Rose of Lima, Sandy Spring Friends Peace Committee, Progressive Democrats of America, Jewish Voice for Peace, DC Metro, Democratic Socialists of America, Montgomery County Civil Rights Coalition, Maryland United for Peace and Justice, Veterans for Peace, Bethesda Friends, Meeting Peace Committee, the Nation Discussion Group, DC Metro, and Montgomery College Peace and Justice Studies Community. So we have a lot of co-sponsors that we're really pleased about, and we thank all of you both for coming, and if you're representing one of those groups, for being one of the co-sponsors and helping us to get information out. And I want to say, with respect to Montgomery College, if there are any students here who would like credit for attending tonight, you should talk to Alonzo. Where is Alonzo? So Alonzo's waving his hand over there, so if you're a student and you want credit, he has something that he'll sign for you. So I'm with Peace Action Montgomery, and we are an all-volunteer group in the county working for peace and justice. We have three primary goals that we work on: peaceful U.S. foreign relations, that would be stopping any wars that we're involved in and occupations and preventing any new ones; a peace economy at home, that is using the money that goes to wars for the things that we need here at home; and support for human rights and international cooperation. We hope that if you're not already a member of Peace Action Montgomery, that you will join us, or that you will want to participate with us. There are a number of things that you can do. One thing is to sign up for our e-letter, and if you registered, we'll make sure that you're on the list if you aren't already. We don't bombard you with emails. Usually there's only one or two a month at the most. In most of our e-letters, we ask you to take action, because our motto is action, that it isn't enough to just be informed. It isn't enough to just know about what's going on. We have to do something about it. And so most of our e-letters will give you something that you can do. If you would like to be more involved, we have committees. Our committees are fairly small at this point. We have one on Palestine, we have one on Syria and ISIS, we have one sort of on military spending, and we have one on trying to establish a Montgomery County Peace Council. So if you would like to be involved in any of those committees, please make sure that you note it on the sign-in sheet. If you have an idea for another committee, a different one, we'd certainly be interested in that. You can also come to steering committee meetings if you would like to be more involved. And I would like to introduce you to the steering committee members, all of whom helped us to set up this meeting. Bahram Zandi, Bob Cook, Adrian Nicosia, Alonzo Smith, Tim Willard, and we have a couple more, but I don't think they're here tonight. And finally, in terms of things that you could do, we do accept donations. Contributions are also welcome, and we have a couple of boxes around, so if you would like to make a contribution, you're more than welcome to do so. Also, there are some books for sale in the back. Those are my books that I'm selling, and all of the contributions, whatever you want to pay for those books, whatever you think they're worth, any of them, if you just put it in the box, you can have the book. And I've read them all, and they're real good, and so I highly recommend them. And all of the money from that sale will go to Peace Action Montgomery. In addition, we also have some books at a different table that are being sold by one of our speakers, Phyllis Bennis. And Phyllis, as I'm sure most of you know, is an outstanding writer as well as an outstanding speaker, so you may want to buy one of her new books. And then finally, you'll notice some jewelry and other crafts in the back of the room. If you purchase any of those items, that money will go to the Afghan Women's Fund. This is a group that Peace Action Montgomery has supported for about the last 3 years. It's a wonderful organization in Afghanistan that supports women and children, particularly school projects, medical projects, and women's cooperatives. And I'm on the board, so maybe I'm a little bit prejudiced, but we have no overhead. It's an all-volunteer organization. I've been to Kabul and seen the kinds of things that the project supports, so I can assure you that your money is well used. So if you would like to buy some wonderful crafts from Afghanistan, you can do so at the break or at the end of our program. And finally, there is a flyer in the back. It's on colored paper, and that's our Take Action flyer for this event. As I mentioned at the beginning, we think that action is the most important thing that we can do. And so we put together some ideas of things that we would encourage you to do that's related to our event tonight. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Bahram Zandi, who is co-chair of the International Committee of the U.S. Green Party, and Bahram is going to introduce our speakers.
Thank you very much, Jane. Welcome. Thanks all for coming here. Before I introduce the speakers, a couple of announcements I want to make. There is going to be the Maryland United for Peace and Justice 30th Annual Conference in Baltimore on May 1st and 2nd. There's a good list of speakers there. Phyllis Dennis will be there, Ray McGovern, and also Paul Jay will have a workshop there. And Paul Jay also will speak at this at the high school in Virginia called James Mason High School in Virginia. He'll be speaking on Monday, the 20th of April at 7. There's more information on these, and there's also a flyer on that conference in the table. And I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers in the order that they will speak. They each speak about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a break, and after that we'll go to the question and answer comments. Raed Jarrah serves as AFSC's Policy Impact Coordinator at the Office of Public Policy and Advocacy in Washington, D.C. Since his immigration to the U.S. in 2005, he has worked on political and cultural issues pertaining to U.S. engagement in the Arab and Muslim worlds. Widely recognized as an expert on political, social, and economical developments in the Middle East. He has testified in numerous congressional hearings and briefings, and he's a frequent guest on national and international media outlets in both Arabic and English. Dr. Younes Parsabanov is retired Dean and Professor of Political Science, Strayer University, an active member of the Iranian diaspora. He is author of 2-volume book, 100-year history of the Iranian political parties and organizations from 1904 to 2004. And he's also author of over 100 other articles about Iran and the world in Persian and English. And Phyllis Dennis directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies and is a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She has been a writer, analyst, and activist on Middle East and UN issues for many years. In 2001, she helped found and remains on the advisory board of the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation. She writes and speaks widely across the US and around the world as part of the Global Peace Movement. And she has her books here for sale, and she's here to sign them for you. On that back table, you can find her books there, and she will sign for you. Thank you very much, and let's begin with Raed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for attending today. Such a gorgeous day. Sorry you have to sit in a room and listen to me. Thank you for all of the organizers for inviting us. I will focus on the root causes of violence in Syria and Iraq, now that the conflicts in both of these countries have emerged to one regional conflict. I'll speak a little bit about that, and I hope I will be able to address more of your points and comments in the question and answer period. So this week actually marks the 12th year. It's been exactly 12 years since the U.S. Invaded Iraq in 2003. I was in Baghdad on April 9th of 2003. And that's when I saw the first U.S. tank roll down our streets. It was on April 9th. That's the day that many Iraqis view as the day of the beginning of a new era. We don't really think about that day that much in the U.S. I think many Americans view the beginning of the bombing campaign in March as the beginning of the war. Iraqis don't really care about that day, the March 21st, because from an Iraqi perspective, the war did not really start on March 21st, 2003. The war started in January of 1991 and never stopped. So March 21st was only a more intense campaign, a very intense campaign of bombing, but it didn't really create a new condition for Iraqis. April 9th did. April 9th ended Iraq's sovereignty and the era of Iraqis' self-rule, and of course the U.S. started a U.S.-led military occupation of the country. Now, since 1991, there has been almost the same policy of engagement with Iraq from the U.S. perspective, which is really crazy when you think about it. We're discussing policy with a country that went through 4 different presidents, from Bush Sr. and Clinton and Bush Jr. and now President Obama. But President Obama was the 4th consecutive U.S. president to announce that he has authorized another round of bombing on Iraq back in August of last year. So the policy in Iraq has been consistent, very bad, but consistent. And but we still have this, the mainstream narrative that we hear is that, whoops, there is this one thing that happened this week. There's this one group that showed up this week. It's called ISIS. This one group that is emerging, this week called Al-Qaeda. There's this one reason why we have to do this one thing, which is bomb the country. And that has been more or less the story of Iraq for the last 23 years. So it's a long series of oops and oops that leads to more military interventions. But more importantly, those military the series of military interventions and violence in Iraq, they were not really happening in this black hole of violence with no agenda. Because there is a very systematic approach in destroying Iraq's unity and territorial integrity. Like if you look back to 1991, the U.S. imposed no-fly zones to the country. And the no-fly zones came from a theory that the Iraqi central government is oppressing some Iraqi ethnic groups, and the U.S. has to protect Kurds in the north and Shiites in the south from the Iraqi central government. Like that was the theme that was repeated in the early 90s. And that theme of the need to recognize Iraq's ethnic and sectarian groups as governing groups continued throughout until this day. The US declared policy in Iraq until now, 2015, is to support Sunni and Shiite and Kurdish and other regional autonomies in Iraq, right? So like to have some autonomous regions that are Kurdish or Shiite or Christian. So I'll talk a little bit about that and what does that have to do with the roots of violence in the country. Now, in 2003, when the first official announcement of attempting to create a new system in Iran based on ethnic and sectarian affiliations took place, many people were confused about it. I'm one of them. Because the US created a governing council that has Iraqis selected based on their ethnic and sectarian backgrounds. It's the first time in Iraq's contemporary history that Iraqis were chosen to run the country based on their ethnic and sectarian backgrounds. You're on the council as a Sunni, you're on the council as a Shiite. Now, this statement that I just made contradicts with conventional wisdom in the US, because many of the US audiences were told over and over that the former Iraqi government was a Sunni-led government. And I completely disagree with that characterization of the former Iraqi government. Because the former Iraqi government, although it was a dictatorship, a brutal dictatorship in many occasions, was very secular. It actually hated all religions equally. True. And one of the examples that I give, I mean, from my personal experience under the former Iraqi government, as someone who is half Sunni and half Shiite myself, or as they call us in Iraq, sushis. We had this experience living there. I have never been asked in my entire life until 2003 if I was a Sunni or a Shiite. And I have never seen someone in my entire life being asked if they were Sunni or Shiite. I don't know who from my friend or family are Sunnis or Shiites. And I think that's the most important point, is that I grew up in Iraq, went to school there, and I have no idea who from my friends were a Sunni or a Shiite. It wasn't a part of our identity. It's not that people were tolerant to each other. It was really not an issue of identity within the country. And because of some cultural revolutionary revolutionary ideas that came in the 60s, Iraqis stopped using their last names and they changed the naming system. So people in Iraq, they don't know me as Ra'id Jarrah. People know me as Ra'id Azzam. It's my father's name. So your father's name is your last name. So it's an attempt to destroy tribalism and affiliation based on last name. So because of that, people don't really know who is who. Even if you knew people's last name, most of the larger tribes in Iraq has Shiite and Sunni branches, actually even across ethnic branches. Another more solid example is the 55 deck of cards that was produced by the Pentagon in 2003. And many of you remember that. That's the list of the top 55 leaders that the US wanted to capture or kill. I don't think any Iraqis would argue against the fact that those were indeed the top 55 leaders in Iraq. But the fact of the matter is that 36 of them were Shiites. So 36 out of the 55 were Shiites. The two vice presidents were a Kurd who's a Shiite and a Christian. Now, this is not to sugarcoat any of the crimes committed by the former Iraqi government or to say it's an inclusive utopian. No, it wasn't. It was a truly brutal dictatorship, and many people paid a price for that. But it wasn't sectarian. It was a different type of dictatorship. So back to my point about 2003, when the governing council was introduced, that was the first time that these type of politics were introduced in the country. Now, people like me said, it's a crazy idea to try to create a Shiistan and the Sunnistan and the Kurdistan, because simply you can't. Iraq's demographics are so complicated that you can't create a region that is exclusively Shiite, because there are millions of Sunnis who live in the south. Millions of Sunnis in Basra and the south of Iraq. You can't create a region that's exclusively Shiite in the middle, because there are millions of Shiites who live in the middle. And even the north is very much mixed between Kurds and Arabs. Although it has more of a specificity, like Iraqi Kurds had self-autonomy even before. But demographically, it wasn't a black and white region as well. Now, the violence that took place in the last 13 years took care of that problem. Now, Iraq in 2015 does not have millions of Sunnis in the south or millions of Shiites in the middle. And that didn't happen by coincidence. That happened because there was a plan of ethnic cleansing and sectarian cleansing in the country. I invite all of you to check out Human Rights Watch's website. Human Rights Watch just issued a new report a couple of weeks ago about the attack on Amerli. And that's like the most recent example of an attack against an Iraqi city. And that attack tells the story about how when the Iraqi Shiite militias, extremely sectarian militias that have been committing violations of human rights, war crimes, and atrocities as bad as ISIS, but they're funded by our tax dollars, they're our friends in this context. Those militias have been participating in the ethnic and sectarian cleansing of the country since 2003. In Amerli, the report shows how after they took over control over this Iraqi town that was controlled by ISIS for a while, they burned the homes of every single Sunni Arab who lives in the villages surrounding Amerli. So the maps that Human Rights Watch included in the report are amazing. When you look at these maps of villages, talking about villages of 2,000 and 3,000 people, homes are burned one by one because of a database. People know people's addresses, and they went after they took control of the city and burned 200 houses in this town, 300 houses in this town. They, passed over the houses that they were not supposed to burn. It's an amazingly coordinated campaign of ethnic cleansing. And it's not really like a random act of violence based on some extremist idea. There is something happening behind that. So when we talk about 6 million Iraqis being moved in the last 13 years, many of these Iraqis were moved because of a very systematic plan of ethnic cleansing inside the country. So now when you look at the map of Iraq, it has been ethnically cleansed. And now it's easier to create a Shiistan and the Sunnistan and the Kurdistan. Now, in addition to the creation of these sectarian and ethnic politics in Iraq in 2003, there was the destruction of the Iraqi armed forces completely. Iraq used to have very strong armed forces before. They were completely dismantled by the US and replaced by mostly sectarian and ethnic militias. So imagine this combination. Imagine we're living in the US now. We have issues with our police department, of course, and we have major issues. Many people in this room would criticize the way that the police and governing systems in the US have been working historically. But imagine if a foreign power comes and completely dismantles all of the systems that we have. Many of them are broken. And people start creating ethnic and sectarian militias here in the US. So white people are pushed to live alone, black people are pushed to live alone and have their militias go around the neighborhood. I mean, imagine the level of violence that would come out of there, And that's, I think, one of the main root causes for violence in Iraq. One of the main root causes of violence is the destruction of the Iraqi national identity, so it was replaced by sectarian and ethnic and religious identities, and then the destruction of the institutions of the central government was replaced by ethnic and sectarian militias. People reverted to their ethnic and sectarian identities and reverted to someone holding a gun and calling themselves a Shiite or a Sunni rather than an Iraqi. So in this condition, of course we would have an ISIS and an Al-Qaeda and Shmisis, whatever we call it. There will be Sunni groups that are sectarian and that will be committing violations. There will be Shiite groups. There will be Kurdish groups. There are Yazidi groups. It's a mess in Iraq and in Syria. And I think that all what I described in Iraq is similar in Syria in the sense of the weakening of the central government in Syria and how the civil conflict there played itself. Now, the same as what I described in Iraq over 13 years, Syria has been going through the same type of a conflict on steroid over the last 2 or 3 years. Introduction of sectarian groups, destruction of a central government, new ethnic and sectarian politics introduced to the country. And now what Syria lives through is a multi-party civil war that has at least 3 or 4 different groups fighting against each other. Very similar to what's going on in Iraq. The US is supporting some of these groups against other groups. And that is another important point to keep in mind, that the US is an active participant in both of these conflicts, the one in Iraq and in Syria. We're not only watching them, and we're taking sides. Now in Iraq, the US is taking the side of the Iraqi central government against what is at least perceived to be a majority Sunni uprising against that government. And in Syria, the US at least says that it's taking the side of some Sunni rebels who are revolting against what is an Alawite or Shiite government in Damascus. So it doesn't make any sense when you think about it from a regional perspective, because the US is actually taking opposite sides of the same conflict. The central government in Baghdad and in Syria are very close allies, and groups in Iraq and Syria who are outside the control of the central government are pretty much allies, whether it's ISIS going across the border or whether it's other groups. So when you look at the roots of ISIS itself, although it started as the Islamic State of Iraq back in 2007, ISI, and now it's spread to become this larger group in both countries, you can't really point out to ISIS as the reason for the violence in Iraq and Syria. ISIS is a symptom for what's going on. That's a symptom of lack of governance and lack of national unity in both Iraq and Syria. When you look at the particular case of Syria, the current positioning of ISIS is extremely confusing to many. So the same way that I asked you to go to Human Rights Watch's website to zoom in at that village level to see the dynamics, what's going on around Amerli, you should also check the news with what's happening around Al Yarmouk refugee camp south of Damascus in the last few weeks, as an example of the larger chaos in Syria. You have a camp, which is one of the largest camps of Palestinian refugees from Israel, who were hoping to go back home one day. This camp was one of the symbols of the right of return of Palestinians. It has been systematically destroyed as well. Out of the 140,000 residents of the camp, 20,000 remain. And the camp is being attacked by the Syrian government on the one side, ISIS on the other side, and there are 4 different groups inside the camp who are either fighting against each other or against the Syrian government and against ISIS. So it's this picture of the levels of complexity of that conflict in Syria. It's not easy to describe the conflict in Syria because this is how the conflict is supposed to be. It is supposed to be this extremely chaotic violence that is hard to resolve. And whether it's the groups involved in it directly or whether it's regional powers involved, many people are interested in continuing this type of violence there. I hope I touched on some of the issues that you all are interested in. I'll stop here and I will try to speak a little bit more about issues that has to do with Iraq and Syria and ISIS in the question and answer. Thank you.
Jean and Baron, thank you very much for inviting me. About a week ago, I was telling one of my friends in Europe, that I'm invited to speak to my great American friends about demystifying Syria. I said it's a very difficult job to demystify Syria and demystify IS. But I will try tonight. On three important terms, I will emphasize how we can demystify Syria. And my colleague Ryan gave a lot of factual information about demystifying the wars in the Middle East. Number one is globalization of Monroe Doctrine. After the Second World War, the United States became superpower because Soviet Union was victorious but weak. England, France, Germany and Japan, they were defeated. England and France emerged as victors but very weak. So the United States emerged superpower. Later on, my intellectual Nigerian friends at Howard University, they used to call United States in early 1960 super duper. Now this super duper, this superpower, if you remember Truman Doctrine and Eisenhower Doctrine, during that era, immediately after the Second World War, they believed that the United States has mission, historical mission, to globalize Monroe Doctrine, convert 9 major strategic regions of the world into the backyard of the United States. Make those regions that they were strategically important as backyard as they had done with Latin American countries. But this idea of globalizing Monroe Doctrine faced 3 major challenges in early 60s. Number one was the emergence of Soviet Union as another superpower. Number two was the spread of national liberation movements throughout the countries, throughout the whole world. This major national liberation movement was another challenge to the United States. And the third one was the emergence of social democratic workers' parties in what today we call Atlantic Europe, like England, France, but especially Germany and Italy. Now these 3 major challenges, they were for many reasons that tonight we don't have to talk about it. They started dwindling and collapsing. By 1991, all those 3 major challenges had been collapsed. Soviet Union encountered not only collapse, but division into 16 different independent countries from each other. So immediately after the end of the Cold War and the beginning of what we call today, after the period of after the Cold War, which has been now 25 years, from 1991 all the way up to 2015. 25 years of living in a period that historians call the period after the end of the Cold War. Now, during this last 25 years, at the beginning, what the US did, neocons in the United States, with the support of Samuel Huntington and Fukuyama and other students of Samuel Huntington, they came up with the idea that now we can internationalize or globalize Monroe Doctrine. Region number one was naturally Middle East, Greater Middle East. We will make sure that Great Middle East will become backyard of US. Backyard of US hegemony, US imperialism. So what did they do? They had to come up with a very important theoretical framework, and that was clash of civilizations. Huntington, but especially later on his students like Fukuyama, they advocated that the era of national struggle on the one hand, class warfare or class struggles on the other hand, have come to an end. In fact, Fukuyama wrote the famous book, The End of History. In that book, Fukuyama explains the era of national struggle and the era of class struggle is over. From now on, we are entering into what? Clash of civilizations. That is the framework that the United States and its allies tried imperialist, collective imperialism. Japan, EU, so-called EU, maybe we should say Germany and United States. They did come up with the idea of clash of civilizations in order to spread what Wright completely factually mentioned, good examples of it in, for example, inside Iraq. But there are many, many countries that US has waged since American invasion of Iraq, even before Iraq, in Afghanistan, under the name of clash of civilizations. We call them visible wars and invisible wars. United States right now engaged in 26 invisible wars that majority of people in the world, they don't even know where United States is involved. War in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, war in Syria, war in Ukraine are visible wars. All of us, we know. But very, very few individuals, even among the journalists, they will see that the United States right now is involved in island of Mindanao, which is twice as large as Iraq, with 3 times more population than Iraq. The United States is involved there, the way the United States is involved in Iraq. So clash of civilizations is spread all over the Middle East today. Otherwise, like Wright, you mentioned correctly, the conflict still in those countries is the conflict between either nations, nationalities, or classes, between poor and rich, rather than between Shiites and Sunnis, or Christians and Jews, or Hindus, or Buddhists. I will add here something to clash of civilization. Clash of civilization goes hand in hand with fundamentalism. It's very important to recognize that religious fundamentalism, any religious fundamentalism, does not come from those societies. They are injected from outside. Believe me, you can ask any Jewish scholar who is not a Zionist, they will tell you that Zionism did not come from Jewish communities. Zionism was byproduct of a specific phase of capitalist development in Europe. Had nothing to do with Jewish ghetto dwellers of Warsaw or Jewish villages in Iran, in Iraq, but especially in Yemen, majority of them being Sephardic Jews. They had nothing to do with Zionism. Islamic fundamentalism is the same. Islamic fundamentalism is injected into Muslim societies. Soon, Modi will come to United States, Prime Minister of India. Prime Minister of India is the leader of a fundamentalist Hindu party in India. Ayatollah Khamenei is another fundamentalist who is in power in Iran. Well, Netanyahu is another fundamentalist, except Jewish fundamentalism, which is Zionism. Now, I will tell you the irony about these individuals that I mentioned. Recep Tayyip Erdogan is another fundamentalist in Turkey. Each one of these fundamentalists that I mentioned, and Iranians can add to it Rafsanjani, Rouhani, Ayatollah Khatami, all of these fundamentalists, they have not written one article in the last 5 years about theology of either Islam or Judaism, or in case of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he has not written any single book or article on Islamic fundamentalism. All of these individuals that I mentioned, they have written many, many articles. Check on Erdogan. Check on Netanyahu. Netanyahu has not written any single book or article on theology of Judaism. Or Khamenei has not written any article on sociology of Islamic religion. All the fundamentalists, what do they write? Look at all the transcriptions of Netanyahu's, Khamenei's, and Erdogan's, Modi's speeches, that they have been transcribed into English languages, into French language, into English language, other languages. All of them are how to seize power, political power, government power. Khamenei, Erdogan, and Netanyahu do not know anything about theology of Islam or Judaism. What they know, they are number one in privatization. Privatization in Iran and in Israel created huge number of unemployment in those countries. They are expert on that. In fact, Netanyahu, unlike principal teachings of Judaism, Khamenei, unlike principal teachings of Islam, Modi, unlike principal teachings of Hinduism, they believe that private ownership of property, including land, including whatever exists within land, is sacred. That is not in any document, any classic textbook of Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, or Christianity. So it's very important. What today we see in Syria is manifestation of globalization of Monroe Doctrine, because if the United States has hegemony over oil in the Middle East, then the United States can dictate its worldwide policy to its own partners, plus to its own even rivals like Russia and China. And today, another aspect of demystification of Syria is that Syrian war is organically, directly related to war in Ukraine. War in Ukraine, if United States succeeds in completely weakening and castrating Putin's Russia, then United States will be able to come up with its final, ultimate policy strategy in the world to contain China. Thank you very much. My time is over.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming out on this extraordinarily beautiful day, our first real day of spring, to talk about a rather grim subject, but one which I think also has an upside, surprisingly enough, which has to do with us, has to do with what we do in response to all this. We heard from Jean earlier about the importance of action, and I'm going to talk some about action. But I think it's also important that we keep some of our focus on the question of United States policy in these wars. This has been a really important background and backdrop for what we see on the ground in Syria, in Iraq, increasingly in Yemen, in Libya. It's a widening war. And it is in many ways the continuation of George W. Bush's global war on terror, the GWOT. It was always one of my favorite acronyms because it sounds so evil. GWOT. And it sounds very much like what it is. But this is, I think it was Ratner who said, this is the global war on terror on steroids. This is the global war on terror 2.0. Now it's different. It's different than the Bush version of the global war on terror, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it is still a global war on terror that people on the ground are paying an extraordinary price for. A price in human lives, a price in dignity, a price in homes, a price in families. It's a shocking and astonishing and horrifying price that many people in our country are simply not aware enough of. Because while we see headlines about the danger of ISIS, who is ISIS and why do we have to kill them? You know, I was looking at books yesterday on Amazon, not because I buy from Amazon, I don't and you shouldn't, but because full confession, I have a new book about to come out on ISIS and the global war on terror, and I was looking at what's the competition. And there's like 30 or 40 or 50 new books out there that have come out in the last few months that are all called some version of who is ISIS and why do we have to kill them? Who is ISIS and why are they a threat to our way of life? And this is a huge, serious problem because what it reflects is the same terrorizing of us that we heard from President Bush on September 12th of 2001. Looking around the room, I see almost everyone in this room is old enough to remember that day. This is not a good thing, folks. This is a challenge to us all about bringing in young people, which includes not having events on Saturday nights, because really, what students are going to come out on a Saturday night? But seriously, you all will remember when George Bush said, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. We go to war or we let them get away with it. That's the option we were given. And when that is the choice, it's not surprising that people don't choose to, quote, let them get away with it. People choose war. And it's happening again, because what we are told is, it's a terrible situation. The humanitarian situation is awful. That part is true. It's more true than they're saying. It is more horrifying